The Great Law of Peace. The Iroquois Constitution that influenced the U.S. Founding Fathers. Introduction. A whisper in the trees. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're lying in a forest. There's no traffic, no buzzing phones, no email pings. Just the sound of wind brushing through tall pine trees. Somewhere in the distance, a river hums a sleepy tune. Birds are whispering secrets, maybe even gossiping a little. But here, in this forest, something ancient is breathing, something that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's called the Great Law of Peace. Long before there were red, white, and blue flags, before a man named George wore a powdered wig and got stuck in every elementary school textbook, there were the Haudenosaunee, a group of Native American nations, also called the Iroquois Confederacy. They lived by a different kind of law, one not written on paper, but remembered in minds, in beads, and in stories passed down by firelight. And believe it or not, this very law helped inspire the U.S. Constitution. Yes, the Founding Fathers might have been sipping tea and quoting big French philosophers, but they were also sitting at councils with native leaders, listening to how things worked under the Great Law. So tonight, let's wander back into that forest. Let's walk slowly, without rush, into a world where peace was more than a dream. We'll meet visionaries, warriors turned healers, chiefs with snakes in their hair. No, really, and a tree with roots reaching out to the ends of the earth. All right, ready? Let's begin. Chapter 1. A Land Before Borders. Let's go way back. And I mean way back. Before America had fast food, football, or founding fathers. Before it had a name at all. Back when the land didn't have fences or road signs. When forests stretched forever and rivers didn't care where one tribe's land ended and another s began. It was just Earth, doing its thing. And living on that land were the Haudenosaunee. That's a long word, but don't worry, we'll say it slow. Ho-d-no-show-nay. It means people of the Longhouse. They were also called the Iroquois, which is what French folks called them. But Haudenosaunee is what they called themselves, so we're gonna use that. Now this wasn't just one group. The Haudenosaunee were actually 5 nations, 6, eventually. These weren't small villages either, they were powerful, complex, full-on nations. Each with their own chiefs, clans, traditions, and style. Here's the lineup. Mohawk. They were like the eastern gatekeepers. Oneida Onondaga. They kept the central fire going. Cayuga Seneca, holding down the western side. Imagine a big longhouse, super long, stretching across the forest, and each nation had a door. Mohawk on one end, Seneca on the other, Onondaga in the middle, and everyone else cozied up in between. But here's the twist. Even though they were like one big family, they were not getting along. Actually, they were fighting. A lot. Not like a little bickering over who left the bear meat out overnight. We're talking serious, painful stuff, raids, battles, long cycles of revenge that stretched for generations. If one clan hurt another, that clan had to get even. And when they did, the first one had to strike back again. Back and forth, back and forth. A lot of people got hurt. Families were torn apart. Children grew up expecting to fight someday. And the saddest part, no one really remembered how it started anymore. The anger was just always there. But the land didn't pick sides. It still gave them deer to hunt and rivers full of fish. It still let the corn grow. The wind still blew through the trees, carrying stories. And those stories, some of them whispered about peace. Let's pause for a second and picture this world. The Haudenosaunee lived in long houses, big wooden buildings, sometimes longer than 200 feet. Think of them like apartment buildings made of bark. Inside, big families lived together, each with their own cooking fire. There were walkways down the middle, and smoke holes in the roof. Cozy, warm, and full of stories. Kids played outside with sticks and stones, literally. Elders sat around giving advice whether you asked for it or not. And hunters brought home the good stuffed turkey, venison, fish. There were rules, clan systems, ceremonies, even sports. People laughed, cried, danced, and sang. It wasn't some Stone Age wilderness. It was organized, rich in culture, beautiful in its own way, but still, those wars. Every nation was powerful. Everyone wanted to be strong. And when you mix strength with revenge, well, you get chaos. Let's say you were a young person growing up back then. You'd probably hear two kinds of stories at night. Stories of the great spirits, how the sky was made, how animals got their traits, and why the turtle carries the world on its back. And stories of who hurt who, and why you'd better remember it, because someday it might be your job to do something about it. That second one, not exactly relaxing bedtime material. The people were getting tired. Not weak, just exhausted. Grief builds up when it's passed down over time. You can only carry so many heavy stories before they start to wear on your soul. And slowly, a question started bubbling up among the elders, the mothers, the chiefs. Is this the only way? Now, they didn't have social media or group texts. You couldn't just message everyone and ask, "Hey y'all, wanna try peace instead?" But you know what they did have? Dreams. Not just the kind you get after too much roasted corn. I'm talking about spirit dreams, visions, messages from something deeper. Some people started dreaming of a different future. One where the 5 nations didn't fight anymore. One where they came together, like fingers on a hand, separate, but stronger together. One of these dreamers would become a legend. A man with a strange canoe, one made of stone, but we'll talk more about him in the next chapter. Right now, we're still in that fragile moment just before everything changed. Okay, back to the ground. Let's zoom in on the day-to-day. You're walking through the woods. You pass through a clearing where a game of stickball is happening. It's loud, competitive, and half the players are already arguing about the score. Typical. You keep walking. You see smoke rising from the top of longhouses. Women are grinding corn, boiling soup. Kids are weaving reeds into baskets. Grandfathers are mumbling about how things were better back in their day. And above it all, you feel this quiet pressure. It's not the kind you feel before a storm. It's the kind you feel when something's about to shift. Like everyone's been waiting for a sign, a change. Some say the animals knew first, that the birds sang differently that year. The wolves howled from places they usually didn't. The rivers ran clearer. Or maybe, the people just started listening differently. Because when you've had enough pain, your ears tune in to peace in a new way. So let's take a moment to just breathe. Sit with this scene. A world full of life, history, laughter, and yes, wounds. But not broken. Not beyond repair. Just waiting. Waiting for a spark. And soon, that spark would come. A man in a canoe would glide across the lake. Not just any canoe, stone canoe. He would bring words, not weapons. A vision of 5 fires burning together. A world where decisions were made slowly, with patience. Where peace wasn't just the absence of war, it was a way of life. But for now, that vision is still just a whisper in the trees. A thought in the hearts of mothers. A murmur in council fires. Peace is coming, and with it a new kind of power. Not the kind that conquers, the kind that connects. Chapter 2. A world torn by conflict. So let's pick up where we left off. The Haudenosaunee, 5 proud nations living in a land of endless trees, lakes that shine like mirrors, and skies where the stars actually show up. They hunted, they farmed, they danced, they told stories, and they also fought. A lot. Not in a hey let's settle this over a cup of tea kind of way. No, this was long, heavy conflict. Sometimes personal, sometimes political, but always serious. If you were a young person back then, chances are you grew up hearing things like, "Remember what the Cayuga did to us 30 winters ago. Don't trust the Onondaga. Your uncle died in one of their raids. We owe them, and someday, you'll help us settle it." Revenge was passed down like a family recipe, and the dish. It was always bitter. You see, these weren't random fights. This was a cycle of blood feuds. One person was harmed. That person's family had to strike back. The other side retaliated. Then the cousins got involved. Then the in-laws. And on it went. Entire generations were born into these conflicts. People didn't even remember how some of the grudges started. They just knew it was their duty to carry them forward. It was like historical trauma mixed with intertribal politics, with a dash of hurt feelings and no therapy. The worst part, no one was really winning. Yes, the Haudenosaunee were strong, skilled warriors. Fierce when they had to be, but where constant war takes a toll. It wears you out. Not just physically, but emotionally. Spiritually, the forests were still green, the rivers still flowed, but inside the people there was grief. Mothers mourned sons who didn't come back. Children grew up afraid. Families lit fires, not to celebrate, but to remember the lost. And under all that, there was something else. Something quieter. Doubt. Was this really the only way? Couldn't there be something different? Let's pause and think about how that feels. Imagine carrying anger that doesn't even belong to you. Someone in your clan was wronged long before you were born. And now it's your job to get even. But your heart, it's not in it. That kind of confusion eats at people. Some of the elders began to speak softly about another path. Not all of them, but some. A few voices in the wind, whispering ideas that sounded strange, maybe even dangerous. What if, they said, we stopped? Not stopped being strong. Not stopped being proud. But stopped fighting each other. What if we came together? Now don't get it twisted. These weren't weak people hoping to hold hands and sing songs. They were just tired, and wise enough to know that no one survives forever in a never-ending storm. They started to imagine a world where the 5 nations could sit together, eat together, talk, argue, laugh, maybe even work things out without throwing spears at each other. But for something that big, you need more than a good idea. You need a vision. Enter the dreams. Yes, literal dreams. You see, in Haudenosaunee culture, dreams were important. They weren't just oops, I ate too much corn soup type dreams. They were messages from the spirit world, from the ancestors, from something deeper than waking life. And one dream, in particular, would change everything. A dream of a man crossing the Great Lake in a canoe made of stone. That's right, stone. Which, if you're thinking logically, should sink. But this is a vision logic takes a back seat. This man wasn't a warrior. He wasn't famous. But he carried something more powerful than any weapon. He carried words. Words of peace, of unity, of forgiveness. A new way of life. One where the nations didn't destroy each other, but came together to protect the people, the land, and the future. Now, word about this dream started to spread. It was said this man had been sent from the Creator, that he had a mission to deliver the great law of peace. His name, Tadodaho. People also called him the Peacemaker. He didn't arrive with an army. He didn't shout or threaten. He came quietly, calmly. He spoke with kindness and conviction. And when people listened, something stirred inside them. Not fear, not rage, but hope. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Peacemaker's journey was just beginning. At this point in the story, most of the nations were still deeply divided. The fighting hadn't stopped. The blood feuds were still very real. Tadodaho, the twisted Onondaga chief, still held power with a fistful of snakes. We'll meet him soon. But under all that chaos, the seeds of change were being planted. People were starting to wonder, what if? Let's zoom back in for a second. It's night. A fire crackles in the middle of a longhouse. An elder speaks slowly while kids lie on fur blankets, eyes half closed, listening. There was a time when we weren't always at war, the elder says. And there will be a time, I believe, when peace will return. A man is coming. He brings not weapons, but words. Not orders, but wisdom. And the kids. Maybe they smile. Maybe they dream, too. Because even in the darkest times, the idea of peace can be like a candle. Small flickering, but it's there. Lighting the way forward. So here's where we are. The land is full of beauty. The people are full of strength. But the air is thick with sorrow. And something's gotta give. Enter the Peacemaker. Coming in silently, across the water. A stone canoe, and a mission. In the next chapter, we'll meet him properly. We'll follow him through forests and across lakes. As he tries to spread his message. Not everyone listens at first. Some laugh, some threaten. But a few, they hear him. And that's where the real story begins. Chapter 3. The Peacemaker's Journey. Let's go back to that lake. The wind is gentle, the water is calm, and the trees along the shore are leaning in like they're watching something important. Out of the mist, a canoe appears, not made of birch, not carved from wood. It's made of stone, yeah, stone as in heavy, as in shouldn't float, and yet it does. Inside it sits a man, quiet, focused. His eyes hold something ancient, something kind. His name is Tadodaho, but most people would come to call him the Peacemaker. He's not a chief, not a warrior, not rich, just determined, calm but strong. The kind of guy who doesn't raise his voice but somehow makes everyone stop and listen. He's carrying a message, not from a king, not from a council, but from the Creator. And that message is this: peace is possible. Even here, even now. Now, let's be honest, this was not the best time to pitch peace. The five nations were still caught in endless feuds. Trust was low, anger was high, and folks weren't exactly lining up to hold hands and sing Kumbaya under the white pine. But that didn't stop the Peacemaker. He believed that even the most stubborn hearts could change, that the strongest nations could become stronger together, that forgiveness not fear was the way forward. So he started walking, from village to village, nation to nation, alone. At first, people laughed. "Who is this guy? He came in a stone canoe." "Sure, buddy. Go home before someone gets mad." But he kept going, and slowly, someone listened. That someone was a man named Hiawatha. Now Hiawatha wasn't just anyone. He was known across the land, a powerful speaker, smart, respected, sharp as a pine needle, but he was also broken. You see, Hiawatha had suffered deep loss. His daughters had been killed in the violence, his home torn apart, his heart heavy with grief. He had once fought for revenge, but now he was lost, wandering, searching for something, anything that could make sense of all the pain. And that's when he met the Peacemaker. They didn't meet in a palace or a council house. They met under open sky, just two men carrying heavy stories. The Peacemaker spoke of peace, of a new way to live, a great law that could unite the nations, protect the people, and bring balance back to the land. And Hiawatha, he didn't laugh. He didn't walk away. He listened. Something about the message hit home. Maybe it was the idea that peace wasn't weakness. It was courage. Or maybe he was just ready to believe in something again. And so Hiawatha joined him. Together, they became a team. Words and wisdom, vision and voice. And the journey began. Their mission was simple, but not easy. Bring the message of peace to all five nations, one by one. That meant walking into places where anger lived, where old grudges burned like cooking fires, where people had been raised to hate. But the Peacemaker wasn't just talking about ending fights. He was talking about changing hearts. That's much harder. It's easy to say, "Let's stop fighting." It's harder to say, "Let's trust each other again." Or "Let's sit in the same room and make decisions together." Or gulp, "Let's forgive." But slowly, village by village, they started to convince people. They told the story of the great tree of peace, a giant white pine with roots stretching in all directions. They said, "If we come together, we will bury our weapons under this tree. Its roots will spread to the four corners of the earth, and anyone seeking peace can follow them and find shelter." They described a council of chiefs, not just from one nation but from all. They spoke of rules, respect, a system where everyone had a voice, where decisions were made slowly, carefully, and with unity. No shouting matches, no surprise attacks, just talking, listening, choosing peace over pride. Some people wept when they heard it. Others were skeptical, and a few got really mad, because change is scary, especially when power is involved. But the Peacemaker and Hiawatha didn't back down. They weren't there to take control. They were there to offer a better way. As the message spread, something beautiful started to happen. One by one, the nations began to open their ears and their hearts. First, the Mohawk agreed. Then the Oneida. Then the Cayuga and Seneca leaned in too. Each time, there were ceremonies, speeches, wampum belts were woven to remember the agreements, because this wasn't something to be forgotten. But there was one nation still holding out, the Onondaga, and their leader, well, Let's just say he was a little complicated. His name was Tadodaho. And if you're imagining some terrifying guy with wild hair, glowing eyes, and snakes literally wriggling in his scalp, you're not far off. The legends say he was twisted in body and mind, that his thoughts were tangled like vines, that snakes lived in his hair and whispered poison into his ears. Whether that was literal or just symbolic, who knows? But the point is, Tadodaho didn't want peace. He liked power. Fear kept him on top. And when you rule through fear, the last thing you want is everyone getting along without you. So yeah, convincing him, not going to be easy. But the Peacemaker and Hiawatha knew they had to try, because without the Onondaga, the council wouldn't be complete. The fire would be missing its center. But that's for next time. For now, let's take a breath and look at what's happened. We started with endless war. We met a man in a stone canoe. We watched him plant seeds of peace, one village at a time, and we saw Hiawatha, once lost in grief, become the voice of a new future. Together they began to build something no one had seen before. A confederacy, not a kingdom, not an empire, but a family of nations, bound not by force, but by choice. In the next chapter, we'll walk into the shadows, into the mind of Tadodaho, and witness one of the most powerful transformations in the whole story. Because peace isn't just about planting a tree. Sometimes it's about untangling the roots first. Chapter 4: Hiawatha's Grief. If you follow the trail deep enough into the forest past the places where the sun barely touches the ground and the trees stand like quiet watching elders, you might begin to feel what Hiawatha felt, a kind of heavy silence that sits not just in the air but in the chest, a weight not caused by anything you can see but by all the things you've lost and can't get back. Before Hiawatha stood beside the Peacemaker, before his voice moved nations and his name was spoken with reverence and respect, he was simply a man walking, alone, carrying sorrow like a heavy bundle slung across his shoulders, moving from place to place. Not to arrive anywhere, but simply to keep moving, because standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant pain. The pain came from a loss so deep that it changed him. It was untamed, the kind of ache that goes away with time, or the type that makes you cry once and then feel better. No, this was the kind of grief that moves in and stays, that reshapes the walls of your mind, and makes joy feel like something that belongs to someone else far away. You see, Hiawatha had once lived a life full of love. He had daughters, bright-eyed girls with laughter that danced through the longhouse like wind chimes in the spring, but the violence that tore through the 5 nations, the endless revenge, the blade that always came back around, had taken them from him, stolen the very heartbeat of his world, leaving him standing in the ashes of what once was. And after that, he walked. He didn't lead, he didn't speak. He didn't seek vengeance, not anymore, because he'd already gone down that path and found that it didn't heal. It didn't soothe, it only burned hotter, deeper, until it hollowed him out. So instead he walked, and the people who saw him pass whispered that he had once been important, that he had once held power, but now he was just a man with a shadow in his eyes and no place to go. He wandered through forests and across rivers, over hills and under stars, and all the while, the weight in his chest did not lift, because grief is stubborn, and it follows even the strongest hearts into the deepest woods. And then one day, in the quiet of a forest clearing under trees that had seen more winters than any man he met, another wanderer come. Quiet, steady, The one who came in a canoe, made of stone, the one with a message not of conquest or control, but of peace. Daganoweda, the peacemaker, didn't speak loudly, didn't demand attention, didn't try to overpower Hiawatha's grief with cheerful words or hollow comfort. He simply listened, truly listened, with eyes that didn't look away from pain and a presence that said, "You are not alone." And in that moment, something shifted, not a miracle, not an explosion of light, but a small, warm ember deep inside Hiawatha's chest. A quiet flicker that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond healing. The peacemaker spoke gently of a vision, a great law of peace, a future where the 5 nations no longer tore each other apart, but stood side by side under the branches of a white pine, burying their weapons beneath its roots and lifting their voices in council instead of war. Hiawatha, still weary, still wounded, listened not with hope at first, but with curiosity, and then with the tiniest seed of belief. Because sometimes the most broken people carry the greatest capacity to dream, precisely because they know the cost of destruction. And slowly, as the days passed and the words sank deeper, Hiawatha began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Not joy, not yet, but purpose. He saw that his pain had not made him useless, but had given him the one thing he needed to reach others, understanding. Because when he spoke of grief, he wasn't guessing. When he spoke of sorrow, he didn't need to imagine it. He had lived it. And so Hiawatha chose to walk beside the peacemaker, not as a follower, not as a soldier, but as a voice, a bridge, a man who could take the vision and carry it to the hearts of others. Together, they traveled to the nations, to men, one carrying a vision from the sky, the other carrying the weight of earthbound pain, and people listened, not because they were commanded to, but because truth speaks in quiet tones and carries the echo of lived experience. But even as Hiawatha spread the message, his heart was still heavy, and the peacemaker knew that if this new path was to take root, Hiawatha had to be healed, not erased, not made to forget, but brought back into balance. So they performed the condolence ceremony, one of the most sacred and gentle traditions of the Haudenosaunee, a ceremony not to erase grief, but to honor it, to soothe it, to lift it gently from the shoulders of the one who carries it. With words and songs, they wiped the tears from Hiawatha's face, literally, symbolically with their hands and their hearts. They cleared his mind so that he could think clearly again, and they opened his ears, not just to others, but to wisdom, to spirit, to hope. It was not magic, but it was powerful. And when the ceremony was done, Hiawatha stood straighter, not because his sorrow was gone, but because it was now something he walked beside, not something that crushed him. From that moment forward, Hiawatha became not just a messenger of peace, but a healer, someone who could take his own wounds and turn them into medicine for others. His speeches moved people, not because they were grand or poetic, but because they were real. He would stand before a village and say, "I know pain. I lost everything. And still, I chose peace. You can too." People wept when they heard him. People believed him. And people followed him, not with fear, but with hope. And so, with each passing moon, the message of the great law spread further. The Mohawk listened. The Oneida nodded. The Cayuga and Seneca opened their hearts. But there was still one flame left unlit, one man unmoved. The center of the fire, the one who held the snakes in his hair, Tadodaho. And if peace was to last, if the tree was truly to be planted, they would have to reach him too. But that's another chapter. For now, rest in the truth that even the most broken heart can be mended. That grief, when honored and shared, can lead not to more sorrow but to transformation. And that sometimes, the ones who've lost the most become the ones who teach us how to heal. Chapter 5. The Evil Chief, Confronting Tadodaho. If you follow the trail far enough west, past the quiet rivers and longhouses, past the open council fires and the soft songs of hopeful voices, you'll come to a place where the light doesn't fall quite right, where the wind moves like it's nervous, and the trees seem to lean away instead of toward you, a place thick with silence and heavier with fear, because this is where Tadodaho lived. And if the other chiefs were flames, flickering with power and pride, then Tadodaho was smoke curling, choking, filling every space with uncertainty, with darkness, with something more than just fear, something twisted. Now, people didn't just dislike Tadodaho, they whispered about him like he wasn't quite human anymore. They said his mind was so knotted with anger and greed that his very body had followed. Bones twisted, limbs crooked, his spine curled like a snake, coiled to strike, and his hair, if you believe the stories, was full of actual snakes, slithering, hissing, coiled into his thoughts, whispering things only he could hear. No one really knew what was true anymore. Was he a man? A monster, a symbol of everything the nations feared in themselves? Maybe all three. But what they did know, and what they agreed on without question, was this: he was powerful. Not because he was strong in body, but because his mind was sharp, his will was iron, and his control over the Onondaga Nation, the very heart of the Haudenosaunee, was so complete that even the bravest chiefs hesitated to speak his name above a whisper. And if the great law of peace was to succeed, if the 5 nations were truly to unite beneath the white pine, then that pine needed a center, and that center had to be Tadodaho, not because anyone liked him, but because without him, the council would always be missing a voice, a balance, a firekeeper. And so, the Peacemaker and Hiawatha knew, with clear eyes and steady breath, that their journey, however far it had come, wasn't complete until they stood face to face with the man everyone feared. Now, imagine this. To men, one a gentle visionary who crossed the lake in a stone canoe, the other a broken father turned healer, approaching a place where even birds fall silent, carrying no weapons, no threats, just words and the quiet strength of belief. It sounds like madness, and maybe it was, but sometimes, the wildest courage is the only kind that can melt stone. And so they walked through the forest path where the trees seemed to curl inward, where the air grew thick, where the land itself seemed to hesitate. When they finally reached Tadodaho's camp, they didn't shout, didn't demand, didn't raise their hands. They just stood and waited. When Tadodaho appeared, he was exactly as the legends described, eyes like storm clouds, hunched and still, with a presence that made the forest seem even quieter. His voice, when it came, was dry as bone and sharp as flint. He did not greet them. He asked no questions. He simply stared and waited for them to explain themselves. And the Peacemaker, steady as ever, spoke not with flattery or fear, but with calm dignity, telling the old chief about the vision, about the great law, about a world where the 5 nations could live not in chaos, but in harmony, each one keeping its own identity, its own pride, but choosing to govern together, to guide each other, to protect the people and the land through counsel, not conflict. Tadodaho said nothing. he just stared. And when he finally spoke, his words were thick with scorn. "Peace," he said, "is a fool's dream. Order comes from fear, not love." But Hiawatha, who had once believed the same, stepped forward, not angrily, not with challenge, but with deep, quiet empathy, and told him his story of what had been taken from him, of how rage had once ruled his heart too, and how only peace, not revenge, had given him his life back. He didn't try to break Tadodaho. He didn't try to shame him. He simply said, "There's another way, I found it. And you can too." Now, what happened next is hard to describe. Some say Tadodaho grew furious and roared like thunder. Others say he fell into a strange silence and closed his eyes for a long time. But what we know is that the Peacemaker and Hiawatha did not leave. They stayed. They stayed through the dark of night, lighting a small fire that offered warmth but not comfort. They stayed through his storms of anger and his long, strange silences. They didn't argue. They didn't run. They simply sat and waited. And then, at last, something cracked. Not loudly, not like lightning, more like a heavy branch, slowly bending, until it gave. The healing of Tadodaho was not a single moment. It was a process, gentle, painful, delicate. The Peacemaker and Hiawatha prepared a special ceremony, just for him, unlike any other. They combed his hair, slowly, patiently, symbolically removing the snakes, not real ones, perhaps, but the thoughts, the bitterness, the twisted fears that had poisoned his spirit for so long. Each pass of the comb was a word of forgiveness. Each tangle unraveled was a memory soothed. And when they were done, his head was clear, his spine straightened. His eyes, once clouded with suspicion, now held something softer. And in that still, sacred moment, Tadodaho agreed. He would join the council. He would become its firekeeper. Think about that. The one who had twisted the council into fear, now tasked with keeping the fire at its center, tending it, protecting it, listening as others spoke their truth. It was not weakness. It was the greatest transformation of all. And it proved that even the deepest wounds can heal. Even the most feared hearts can change. Even the snake can become the flamekeeper. So now, the 5 nations were truly one. The great law of peace had been heard, accepted, embraced. Weapons were buried. The white pine was planted. Its roots spread out to the 4 directions, welcoming all who sought shelter under peace. And Tadodaho, once twisted, now watched over the flame, not as a tyrant, but as a brother. In the next chapter, we'll sit under that great white pine and explore what the great law really meant, its structure, its wisdom, and how it would echo through time, even into the ideas that shaped the future United States. But for now, rest in the knowledge that peace is possible, that even the hardest hearts can open, and that courage sometimes looks like 2 people sitting silently in the dark, waiting for the light to come back. Chapter 6. The Great Tree of Peace. It began with a tree. Not just any tree, not a sapling or a crooked branch fighting for sunlight in the underbrush, but a towering, noble white pine, its needles gathered in bundles of 5, its branches wide and welcoming, its roots stretching far into the earth and farther, still reaching like fingers toward the 4 directions of the world, as if to say, "Come all of you, there is room here for peace." They called it the Tree of Peace, and it stood not just as a tree, but as a symbol, a living, growing promise that the time of blood feuds, burned villages, and lost daughters was over. and that a new way of living had been born, one where reason replaced revenge, where counsel replaced conquest, and where the voices of the people echoed louder than the clash of spears. Under this tree they gathered the 5 nations, no longer scattered and suspicious, but united in purpose: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. Each one powerful, each one proud, each one choosing not out of fear but out of wisdom to bury their weapons literally beneath the roots of the tree. And that moment the burying was not just symbolic, it was sacred. They dug deep, placing arrowheads, war clubs, knives, and all the tools of killing into the earth as if tucking them away forever, saying, not with words but with action, this way of life no longer serves us. The hole was covered, the ground was smoothed, and the tree above it stood taller, brighter, stronger, as if it had always been waiting for this offering of peace. Now, imagine the scene: the white pine shimmering in the sunlight, its needles whispering in the wind, the gathered nations sitting in a great circle, not as enemies, not even as guests, but as relatives, eyes meeting without suspicion, voices rising not in challenge, but in discussion. This was the beginning of the great law of peace, not as an abstract idea but as a living system, an agreement to live together, to solve problems together, to make decisions together, and to protect the land, the people, and the generations still waiting to be born. Each nation would keep its own identity, its own ways, its own leaders, but the council made of chosen sachems or peace chiefs would meet regularly under the watchful eye of the central firekeeper Tadodaho, once twisted, now transformed, to discuss matters that affected all the nations. Decisions weren't made quickly. They weren't made emotionally. They weren't made by one voice shouting the loudest. Instead, they followed a system built around consensus, meaning everyone had to agree, truly agree, for something to move forward. And if even one nation said no, the matter was reconsidered, debated again, patiently, carefully, until unity was found. This was not fast, this was not easy, but it was wise, and it worked. Because decisions made slowly, with every voice respected, have a way of holding firm. The Peacemaker taught them that just as the white pine's roots reached out in every direction, so should the invitation to peace, that even those not yet part of the Haudenosaunee could follow the roots, find the tree, and join the shelter beneath its branches. If they came in sincerity and shared the values of respect, balance, and reason, this was not an exclusive club. It was a circle that could grow, a peace with open arms. At the center of this council sat the Onondaga Nation, not because they were better or more powerful, but because they had been the last to join, the most difficult to convince, and their former resistance had been transformed into a duty. They became the keepers of the council fire, the ones who watched the flame and ensured the rules were followed, the space was respected, and the great law lived on, not just as memory, but as practice. Their job was to listen to every speaker, to every concern, and not to dominate, but to steward the council with wisdom and fairness. And over time, as the system took root, something remarkable began to happen. Children grew up without fear. Villages blossomed. Ceremonies were held, not for mourning, but for gratitude. Stories were told of war, not to glorify it, but to remember why it must never return. And under the shade of the white pine, people began to feel something that hadn't been felt in generations: safety. Not just safety from outsiders or enemies, but from each other, from the old wounds, from the cycle that had once spun like a wheel of blood and loss. But the great tree of peace was not just planted in soil, it was planted in hearts. It became part of the culture, the language, the laws, the ceremonies. It was taught. It was woven into wampum belts, beautiful strands of shell beads arranged in patterns that held memory, that told stories, that served as records of promises made and wisdom passed down. These belts were not decorations, they were sacred texts, read not with eyes, but with hands, with experience, with careful teaching. They ensured that the great law of peace could not be forgotten. Even if the speakers grew old and passed away, the knowledge would stay. The tree would stand. And so the Haudenosaunee Confederacy became one of the oldest living democracies in the world, built not on conquest, not on wealth, but on shared values, mutual respect, and the unwavering belief that peace is not weakness. It is strength, restrained wisdom, shared listening, made sacred. The Five Nations stood united, with the Peacemaker's vision rooted deep in the soil of the land, and deeper still in the soil of the soul. And though he would eventually leave, disappearing into legend as quietly as he arrived, his message remained not in stone tablets or crumbling monuments, but in living tradition, in ceremonies, in councils that still gather under stars, still speak slowly, still listen carefully, still choose the long path of peace over the quick thrill of power. So next time you see a tree, maybe just a tall pine swaying in the breeze, maybe take a second to remember the white pine, the one with 5 needle bundles, the one with roots that reach in every direction, the one that holds buried weapons beneath its feet and welcomes the weary beneath its shade. It is not just a tree, it is a way of living. It is a dream that became real. It is the heartbeat of a people who chose peace and built something that time could not erase. In the next chapter, we'll explore the details of the great law of peace itself, how it was structured, the roles of each nation, and how the Haudenosaunee created a government so thoughtful, so respectful of the people's voice, that it would go on to inspire ideas far beyond their forests, even into the minds of the men who wrote the U.S. Constitution. But for now, let the trees sway, the roots hold, the fire burn softly at the center of the circle. The people are no longer at war, they are at peace. And the tree still stands. Chapter 7: The Structure of the Great Law. Now that the weapons had been buried beneath the roots of the white pine and the nations had taken their seats in the great circle of peace, there came a time not just for dreams and stories, not just for ceremonies and vision, but for structure, for the rules and rhythms that would help turn that fragile, hopeful agreement into something lasting, something living, something that could hold firm when disagreements rose, when tempers flared, when generations passed and memory began to blur. And so, from the gentle voice of the Peacemaker and the steady hands of Hiawatha, came a systema deep, thoughtful, beautiful constitution, not written on paper or carved in stone, but spoken, remembered, sung, woven into belts, told in stories, and passed through time like a river that carries wisdom from mountain to ocean. They called it the Great Law of Peace, and it was not a single law, not a list of rules with punishments and fines, but a whole way of life, a blueprint for how to live together, how to make decisions as a people, how to honor each voice while still moving as one body, how to hold on to peace even when storms threatened from within or beyond. At its heart was the Grand Council, made up of 50 chiefs, or sachems, carefully chosen to represent each of the 5 nations, with their seats arranged in a circle, just like the tree's roots, just like the stars above, just like the seasons that return year after year. Each chief was not a king, not a boss, not a ruler by force, but a servant of the people, a voice chosen because of wisdom, patience, fairness, and the ability to listen deeply before speaking. They were not elected like modern politicians, nor did they rise by war or wealth instead. They were appointed by the clan mothers, the wise elder women of each family line. Because the Haudenosaunee understood that true leadership begins at home, that those who raise the children and know the stories and feel the heartbeat of the village are best suited to recognize a trustworthy voice. Yes, the women, the clan mothers, held great power, not in a showy or loud way, but in the most profound way possible. They held the power to choose and remove leaders, and their word was final. Because a leader who forgot to listen, who acted out of anger or pride, could be pulled back to the earth with one quiet nod from the ones who had put him in place. The council did not shout. It did not vote quickly. It moved like water around a stone, slow, persistent, circling every concern until all had spoken and all had been heard. And only then, only when unanimous agreement was reached, could a decision be made. That's right, unanimous, not majority, not close enough. Every nation, every chief, had to agree before action could be taken. Because peace built on silence or fear is not peace at all, it's just waiting for cracks to form. So they waited, they spoke, they listened again, and again until the truth revealed itself like sunlight breaking through branches. Each nation had a role. The Mohawk were the keepers of the eastern door, the first to greet travelers and to speak on behalf of the people when new matters were brought to council. The Seneca, on the western edge, were the keepers of the western door, protectors of the Confederacy's back, the final voice in long discussions, helping to bring closure and reflection. The Onondaga, sitting at the center, were the firekeepers, holding the sacred council flame, calling the meetings, and ensuring that the discussions stayed balanced, respectful, and true to the law. The Oneida and the Cayuga played supporting roles in maintaining balance, guiding discussion, and ensuring that each voice, even the quiet ones, were never drowned out. Together, the five formed a great circle, not a pyramid, but a circle, where no one sat above the others, where power was shared, not hoarded, where peace was the root, and unity was the fruit. The Great Law also outlined behavior, not just for leaders, but for everyone, lessons about kindness, honesty, patience, hospitality, and responsibility. It taught that when someone is hurt, they should be consoled, not punished. That when mistakes are made, the goal is not shame, but restoration. That gossip and slander can be as harmful as war, and that silence, when used with care, is as powerful as any word. The people were reminded to be thankful not just on holidays, but every day, through the Thanksgiving address. A spoken blessing that acknowledged the trees, the waters, the winds, the sun, the moon, the animals, and the people, every layer of life, as a sacred gift. Even before speaking in council, they would begin with thanks, setting the tone of gratitude and humility, grounding the decisions in respect for all living things. And perhaps the most radical, most forward-thinking part of the Great Law was this: it was designed to last. It included rules for how to pass the teachings down, how to choose future leaders, how to resolve disagreements that hadn't yet even arisen, because the Peacemaker knew that peace, real peace, isn't just a pause between battles, but a system, a living structure that can flex, adapt, and still holds strong. They built it to endure, not just for their own time, but for the 7 generations to come. That phrase, 7 generations, was a guiding star. It meant every decision had to be made, not just for the people here now, but for the great grandchildren, who would one day walk the land, drink the water, raise their families, and inherit the choices made by hands long buried. Imagine that, governing not just for today, but for tomorrow's children, and their children too. And so the great law of peace was not a dream anymore. It was a system, a shape, a rhythm, a tree with roots, a fire with warmth, a council with balance, a voice that belonged to everyone. And the world watched. Nearby nations noticed the peace. The forests grew quieter. The traders returned. The children laughed. And far, far across the ocean, many years later, men building a brand new country would look back and study this council of wise chiefs and clan mothers. This confederacy of nations that ruled without a king, that voted without bloodshed, that honored women, nature, and unity, not perfectly, not without struggle, but with vision, with respect, and with heart. But that part of the story is still ahead. For now, the great law stands. The circle holds. The fire burns low and steady. And peace, true peace, is no longer a hope. It is a reality. It is the law beneath the white pine. It is the voice of the forest when we learn to listen. Chapter 8. The Role of Women and Clan Mothers. Long before the sun touched the horizon each day, before the men rose to tend the fires and the young ones stirred under soft hides, it was the women who moved first, the keepers of rhythm, the watchers of water, the ones whose hands planted the corn, stirred the soup, dried the berries, and whose voices, though quiet, echoed deepest in the longhouses and in the minds of those who led the nations. And if the great law of peace was the spine that held the body of the Haudenosaunee together, then the clan mothers were the heartbeat. Steady, wise, unwavering, and through them flowed not only life but law, leadership, memory, and the calm strength that carried the people through storm after storm. Because you see, in this confederacy of 5 powerful nations, it was not the warriors or the chiefs who held the final say in leadership, it was the women. The matriarchs, the ones who knew every child's first laugh, who traced the lines of family through generations, who guarded the stories like fire in winter. They were not figureheads. They were not quiet. They were not behind the scenes. They were the foundation. Each clan mother, chosen not by popularity, but by wisdom, age, experience, and clarity of spirit, was responsible for selecting the sachems, the chiefs, who would speak for the people in the Grand Council. These weren't casual choices, made in a moment or based on charm or ambition. No, the clan mothers watched for years, observing the boys as they grew into men, listening to how they spoke, how they treated elders, how they resolved disputes, how they walked through grief, how they carried themselves when no one was watching. And when the time came, they would speak his name, sometimes with pride, sometimes with caution. And when that name was spoken, a great responsibility fell upon the man, because he was not stepping into power, but into service. And if he forgot that, if he grew arrogant, cruel, impatient, or dishonest, it was the clan mother, and only the clan mother, who could remove him. She could symbolically take back the antlers, the emblem of chieftainship, and say, without yelling, without ceremony, simply, "You no longer serve us." And that was that. In this world, leadership was not a prize, it was a responsibility. It was a reflection of trust. And that trust began and ended with the women who watched over the clans like trees watch over the river, not blocking it, not forcing it, just guiding it along its natural path. Now, let's talk about the clans themselves. Every person in the Haudenosaunee world belonged to a clan, and every clan was passed down not through the father, but through the mother, because in this society, lineage followed the women, not just in name, but in spirit. If your mother was Bear Clan, you were Bear Clan. If your grandmother was Wolf Clan, so were you. And this wasn't just about identity, it shaped marriage, housing, responsibility, and governance. You didn't marry someone from your own clan that was considered too close, like marrying a sibling. Instead, you married across clans, across nations sometimes, weaving a great network of relational bonds that held the Confederacy together tighter than any treaty could. The women also oversaw the Longhouse, the very home that gave the Haudenosaunee their name. The people of the Longhouse, a name not just about a building, but about a way of living. Within these homes, multiple generations lived together, grandmothers, mothers, daughters, aunties, babies, and it was the older women who guided daily life, cooking, teaching, mediating arguments, preparing medicines, and making sure the values of peace, respect, and balance were passed down like heirlooms. When you listened to your grandmother tell a story by the fire, you weren't just hearing a tale, you were learning the law. You were absorbing the rhythm of justice, the shape of history, the root of your place in the world. And when the great law of peace was first spoken aloud, when the white pine was planted and the weapons were buried beneath its roots, the women were not observers standing on the edge of the circle, they were the ones who reminded the men, softly but firmly, we cannot have peace unless it begins inside the home. Because how could a nation sit in council with respect if a man did not show that same respect to his sisters, his wife, his mother? And so the Peacemaker made sure that the great law recognized and protected the role of women, not as a favor, not as a token, but because it was essential. Without the wisdom of the clan mothers, without the grounding influence of the women, the tree would fall, the fire would die, the council would crumble. Even in ceremonies, the women's voices were vital. They began the Thanksgiving address, leading the people in giving gratitude for the earth, the sky, the animals, the waters. They were the ones who held knowledge of herbal medicine, who guided healing, who taught the cycles of planting, and who ensured that the community stayed in rhythm with the seasons. They were scientists, teachers, historians, and judges, wrapped not in titles but in respect. And through all of this, the clan mothers remained steady, generation after generation, choosing leaders, guiding discussions, remembering the stories, and keeping the law alive, not in books, but in hearts. And perhaps that's why, when European colonists later came and looked at the Haudenosaunee system, they were astonished. They saw that women held power, real power, and not in secret, not behind curtains, but openly, proudly, and with great effectiveness. Some admired it. Some feared it. Some ignored it, pretending it couldn't be real. But it was, and it still is. Because the role of the clan mothers was never erased, not by time, not by war, not by outsiders. Their voices still echo in councils today. Their wisdom still shapes decisions. Their names are still spoken with reverence. So next time someone tells you that history is only written by warriors and kings, You can tell them the story of the clan mothers, the ones who chose the leaders, the ones who watched over the roots of the tree, the ones who made sure that peace wasn't just something said at council but something lived in every home. Because in the Haudenosaunee world, women weren't behind the scenes. They were the center. And their strength, quiet as it may have seemed, was the thread that kept the world from unraveling. In the next chapter we'll explore how the Great Law and this entire system of unity, peace and governance caught the eye of a very different group of people. European thinkers, American revolutionaries, and the men who would someday write another constitution on another continent. But for now, sleep softly, knowing that peace does not only come from force or fire, often begins in a grandmother's hands and a mother's wisdom, in the way a woman chooses to raise a leader who listens. Chapter 9. Influence on the U.S. Constitution far across the great waters. In lands where powdered wigs were common and voices were often raised in fiery debate over tea and taxes, a new idea was rising slowly, noisily, nervously, a dream of a new country free from kings, made by the people, governed not by bloodlines but by principles. And while these early American thinkers gathered in brick halls and candlelit rooms to argue over freedom and rights and government, they were not building their vision from nothing, because ideas, like rivers, often flow from many places at once. And if you listen quietly, beneath the shouts of revolution and the speeches about liberty, you'll hear a softer, older voice echoing from the forests of the northeast woodlands, where the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had already been living their version of democracy, not for a few years or even a generation, but for centuries, with rules, with structure, with balance, and with a peace strong enough to hold 5 proud nations in unity under one great white pine. You see, before there was a constitution signed in Philadelphia, before Washington crossed the Delaware, or Jefferson picked up his pen, men like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were watching, listening, and learning from the nations they met right here on this continent. The Mohawk, the Seneca, the Onondaga had long ago figured out how to govern without kings, how to balance power, how to listen before acting, and how to hold the center steady when the edges began to fray. Benjamin Franklin, who fancied himself both a man of reason and of practical invention, spent many years as a diplomat to the Iroquois and in their councils. He saw something that made his spectacles sparkle with possibility: a working model of federal union, where each nation retained its own identity, but still came together to make shared decisions, through discussion, deliberation, and consensus, not by command from above. He wrote about it, he admired it, he even recommended it. In 1754, at a meeting in Albany, he famously proposed that the British colonies, who were often bickering like jealous cousins, should form a union, much like the Haudenosaunee had done long ago. And while that proposal, known as the Albany Plan of Union, didn't take hold right away, it planted a seed in the minds of many colonial thinkers, who were beginning to realize that if indigenous nations could build peace through cooperation, then maybe the colonies could, too. And it wasn't just Franklin. Thomas Jefferson, known for writing with elegance and confidence, also admired the structure and spirit of native governance, especially the way it checked power, honored the voice of the people, and held leaders accountable to the good of the whole. And John Adams, careful and cautious, studied their laws and diplomacy, noting that decisions weren't rushed, but came only after listening to every voice, a practice he would later admire in theory, even if not always in practice. So when it came time to draft the United States Constitution, there was already an example right here, on the very soil where they stood a living, breathing democracy where balance was key. Women had influence, councils were thoughtful, and no single voice could overpower the whole. Now, some might ask, did the Founding Fathers really take direct inspiration from the Iroquois? And the answer, like most things in history, is not simple, because history is not a single thread, but a tapestry of influence and memory and selective listening. But we do know this. In 1776, the Continental Congress invited leaders from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to meet and discuss unity and peace. We know that in 1775, the Continental Congress recorded official meetings with Mohawk diplomats and presented wampum belt symbols of agreement and continuity. We know that in the years leading up to the Revolution, indigenous nations were being discussed not just as allies or enemies, but as examples of what true federal union could look like. And we know that the great law of peace, with its careful balance, deep respect for voice, shared power, and commitment to peace, had existed for hundreds of years before a single American Constitution was dreamed up. But here's where the story becomes quiet again. Because while the ideas may have traveled, while the admiration was spoken and even written, the acknowledgement was often left behind. The Constitution that was born in Philadelphia did not mention the Haudenosaunee. It did not include their wisdom about clan mothers, or their requirement for consensus, or their spiritual connection to governance. It took the parts that were useful: federal structure, shared councils, checks and balances, and left behind the heart. And so, while the Haudenosaunee influence is undeniable, it was also underappreciated. Still, the legacy lived on, because ideas have a way of surviving, even when credit does not. The Senate echoes the council fire. The concept of states uniting while keeping independence mirrors the 5 nations. The importance of deliberation, of no single leader holding too much power, of law guided by the people, these are echoes of the white pine, of the buried weapons, of the long talks in the forest. Even the symbol of the eagle, used in both traditions, speaks of watching, of protecting, of soaring above to see the whole. And now, in modern times, historians, educators, and native leaders are gently, persistently reminding the world that America's oldest democracy wasn't born in Europe, and didn't begin with George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, but had already been living, breathing, and governing in these lands for centuries. The Haudenosaunee are no footnote. They are the prelude, and their great law of peace rooted in respect, led by the wisdom of women, committed to future generations, not just a historical curiosity, but a model for what government could be still. So the next time someone tells you that democracy came from Athens or Enlightenment thinkers in Europe, you can gently smile and say, well, yes. And also from the forests, from the council fires, from the clan mothers and the stone canoes and the great white pine whose roots still reach in every direction. Because peace is not a new idea, it is an ancient practice. And sometimes, the best teachers are the ones whose names were not written in the textbooks, but whose wisdom is still felt in the shape of the world we live in. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the Great Law helped preserve the identity and unity of the Haudenosaunee through centuries of colonial pressure, war, and attempted erasure, and how, despite it all, the fire still burns at the center of the Longhouse. But for now, let the soft wind carry these thoughts to rest. Let the trees stand, let the eagle soar, and let us remember that freedom, real freedom, begins with listening. Chapter 10. Surviving Colonialism. Keeping the fire alive, the great tree of peace stood tall, and the council fire burned steady, and the people Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, lived with a sense of balance that few could imagine in the wider world. But then came ships on the horizon, sails like wings that did not belong to birds, and from them came strangers tired, curious, desperate, and filled with intentions not yet clear, who would one day be called colonists. And though the tree still stood, and though the nations still met beneath its branches, there was a new wind in the forest, one that carried more than just leaves and snow and the songs of birds, but carried change, and sometimes change comes gently and sometimes it comes with force. In the early days, the newcomers came with open hands and curious eyes, seeking trade, safe passage, furs, alliances, knowledge, and sometimes even friendship, and the Haudenosaunee, as they always had, listened first, speaking in wampum belts, in slow speech, in careful negotiations under the open sky. They offered gifts, they shared food, they explained the council, they explained the tree. But these newcomers were not like the nations the Peacemaker had once united. They did not seek balance, only gain, and their view of land, of law, of leadership, was like looking into a mirror fogged by breath. To the Haudenosaunee, land could not be owned. It was a gift, a responsibility, a relative, something to be cared for, not claimed. But to the colonists, land was a prize, a resource, a property that could be divided and sold and charted into neat little squares. And so began a long, painful unraveling, not because the tree of peace failed, but because it was being cut at from all sides. Treaties were made, some fair, many not signed, often with promises that vanished like mist the moment ink dried. Land was taken, often without understanding or agreement. Missionaries arrived, bringing books and rules and a faith that insisted it must replace all others. And schools came, boarding schools where children were taken from their homes, stripped of their language, their braids, their songs, their names, and told to forget everything that made them who they were. But through it all, the fire never went out, because no matter how far the council was pushed, how many villages were moved, how many stories were whispered instead of sung, there were always those who remembered. The clan mothers still watched. The elders still taught, even in secret. The wampum belts were hidden, protected, passed down. And in longhouses that seemed too small for such vast memories, the great law of peace was still recited, word for word, like a river flowing beneath snow. The Confederacy did not collapse, adapted, it resisted, and it survived. Even as the colonies became states, and the states formed a new country, and that country pushed ever westward, the Haudenosaunee held fast to their way. Sometimes that meant diplomacy, sending ambassadors to Washington, to London, to Ottawa. Sometimes that meant protest, blocking roads, refusing unjust laws, demanding that treaties be honored. Sometimes it simply meant continuing planting the corn, speaking the language, telling the children, "This is who you are." And always, always, the tree remained in the story. Its roots still reached in every direction. Its branches still offered shelter. Even when outsiders no longer saw it, the Haudenosaunee did. And even in war, yes, even in the wars of the colonizers, the fire of the great law was not forgotten. During the American Revolution, the Confederacy was torn, some nations siding with the British, others with the Americans, not because they sought to join those foreign wars, but because survival sometimes meant choosing a side, even when neither one was truly your own. It was a painful time, filled with heartbreak and divisions, and when the war was over, many Haudenosaunee were left landless, betrayed, scattered. But still they rebuilt. They returned to council. They gathered around the fire and spoke the laws again. And through the War of 1812, through the Indian Removal Act, through waves of forced relocation and cultural suppression, through legal battles and broken treaties, they did not forget who they were. There were times the council fire had to be carried like a fragile flame in the hands of just a few. There were times when only one or two fluent speakers of the language remained, but still it burned, still it flickered, still it survived. In the 20th century, as the world grew loud with machines and modern nations forgot their old promises, the Haudenosaunee reclaimed their voice in powerful new ways. Leaders like Descahe, a Cayuga chief, traveled all the way to Geneva, Switzerland in 1923 to speak before the League of Nations, long before the United Nations even existed, saying in a clear, calm voice, "We are not conquered. We are a free people." He spoke not just for land, but for sovereignty, for the right to live by the great law, to govern their people according to ancient rules of peace. And although the League turned him away, the speech was heard, and it echoes still. Later came the fight for recognition, for language revival, for land back not through war, but through law, through persistence, through memory that refused to die. The white pine became a symbol not of something lost, but of something preserved, carried forward not in perfect condition, but like an old canoe patched, weathered, but still afloat, still strong, and the fire it was tended by new hands, young people learning the old songs, mothers teaching words once banned, elders finally able to speak openly again. And so the story of survival is not one of silence, it is one of resistance, resilience, and remembering. Because the fire does not need to be roaring to stay alive. Sometimes all it takes is an ember, a spark, a whispered story, a handful of ash, warm in the palm of someone who knows what it means. And now, today, the Haudenosaunee still gather. The great law is still spoken, the council still meets, and the world, slowly, begins to listen again. So when you hear the phrase keeping the fire alive, know that it is not a metaphor, it is literal, it is sacred, it is ongoing. Because peace must be defended, not with weapons, but with remembrance, with culture, with truth, and with the unshakable knowledge that what was planted under that great white pine has not died, not even after centuries of pressure. The tree is still there, the fire is still there, the people are still there, and the great law of peace continues. In the next chapter, we'll slow down even further and spend time walking through the wampum belts themselves, those ancient records of memory and law beads, strung not just in patterns but in meanings carrying the full weight of history in every strand. But for now, close your eyes and let the wind blow softly across the council fire. Let the tree stand tall in your heart. And remember, survival is not just about enduring, it's about carrying the light forward, no matter how dark the night may be. Chapter 11. Wampum Belts. Memory woven in beads before there were books, before there were inked scrolls, before law was stamped into parchment and tucked away in glass cases. There were beads, simple, small shining bits of shell, smoothed by hand, strung with care, placed in patterns. Not for decoration, but for remembrance. and these beads called wampum carried more meaning than 100 pages ever could, because they were not only seen but felt, not only read but held, and within them lived the breath of the people and the voice of the great law itself. The word wampum comes from the Algonquian languages, but the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, took the idea and gave it purpose beyond trade or adornment. They wove memory into form, threading events, laws, treaties, and teachings into wide belts, each bead a syllable, a symbol, a spark of something sacred. These were not jewelry, they were records, living, ceremonial, undeniable. And they were treated not with casual glance but with reverence, stored, carefully brought out for special moments, spoken over in council, passed from hand to hand with the kind of care you give to a fragile flame in deep winter. Each belt told a story, and unlike the scrolls of kings or the books locked in European cathedrals, these belts could not be stolen and easily read by outsiders. They required training, language, and oral instruction, passed from one trusted speaker to another. Because the belts were not just things, they were relationships, and to understand them fully, you had to know not just the words, but the people behind them. One of the most sacred, the most foundational of all is the Hiawatha belt, a long, narrow band of white beads with 5 dark shapes arranged from end to end, one square on the far left, another on the far right, a triangle in the center, and 2 more squares between. At first glance, it's simple, but in its simplicity lives a whole universe, because that belt is the Confederacy. The far left square is the Mohawk, keepers of the eastern door. The far right square is the Seneca, keepers of the western door. The center tree, the triangle, is the Onondaga, the firekeepers, sitting at the heart of the council. Between them rest the Oneida and the Cayuga, bridging the circle. And the line that runs between them all, that is the path of peace. A reminder that each nation stands in its own strength, yet remains bound together. Bound not by chains, not by force, but by shared memory. This belt, and others like it, were used in council meetings, in treaty ceremonies, and in times of deep reflection. The belts were spoken, not read. A designated wampum keeper would lay out the belt, run fingers across the beads, and recite the message encoded there, not because the beads had magic, but because the story lived in both the hands and the heart, and only through careful teaching could one unlock the full meaning. Sometimes a belt marked a treaty, like when 2 nations agreed to peace. Sometimes it marked a council decision, a change in leadership, or a collective mourning. Sometimes it was created in response to war, to betrayal, to the need to remind future generations of what had been promised. But always, always, the belt was more than an object. It was witness. One of the most famous is the 2-row wampum, a beautiful belt woven of 2 parallel rows of dark beads on a field of white. It tells the story of 2 vessels. One is a European ship, powered by sails and law. The other is a native canoe, moved by paddles and tradition. Both travel the same river. Both move side by side. But neither tries to steer the other. That was the promise. Peace, friendship, forever. But also, non-interference. The belt was a covenant, a mutual understanding. Each group would remain true to its ways, its laws, its customs, and would respect the other's right to do the same. No hierarchy, no domination, just 2 rows on the river. A simple idea, so easy to break, but so powerful when honored. The belts were not kept in vaults. They were not hidden away like treasures in a dragon's cave. They were brought out when needed, carried across distances, laid before councils, presented at gatherings of great importance. Each belt came with a speaker, a person who had trained for years to learn its meaning, someone who could not only recite the story but connect it to the moment. And through them, the past was always present. When someone said, "Let us bring out the belt," what they meant was, "Let us remember who we are." But with colonization came misunderstanding. To many Europeans, the belts looked like trinkets, quaint, symbolic, perhaps artistic. They did not understand that to violate a treaty marked in wampum was to break sacred law, not just political agreement. Some belts were taken. Some were lost. Some were stored in museums far from the people who made them, but not all. Many remained, passed carefully from hand to hand, village to village, elder to apprentice, carried through centuries like portable memory, like a living library stitched in shell. And now, in our time, the belts are still here. They are studied not only by scholars, but by grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Ceremonies continue. Meanings are retaught. Languages are recovered, not as museum pieces, but as daily tools. The wampum belts are once again speaking, and through them, the Haudenosaunee remind the world. History is not dead. It lives in what you choose to carry, in what you refuse to forget, in what you touch, speak, and pass on. So next time you hold something small in your hand, a string of beads, a smooth stone, a lock of hair, remember that sometimes the smallest things hold the greatest truths, that a belt made of shell can carry laws older than countries, that a line of beads can trace the shape of peace, and that memory, when honored, becomes more than the past. It becomes a promise to the future. In the next chapter, we'll return to the Tree of Peace itself and reflect on how the teachings of the Great Law are being practiced in today's world, not as history but as living law, by elders, by youth, by those walking in two worlds and finding the strength to carry both. But for now, let the beads shine in the darkness. Let the council be still. And let the stories rest for the night, like seeds waiting quietly beneath the snow. Chapter 12. Diplomacy with the Newcomers. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, is a group of 5 Native American nations, Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, who have a rich history of diplomacy dating back centuries. This is their story. In this episode, we'll be exploring their history of diplomacy, their unique diplomatic practices, and how their traditions continue to inspire us today. If you enjoy this episode, consider supporting us to help us continue sharing these important stories. Your support allows us to keep our videos free for everyone. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy has a long history of diplomacy. When Europeans first arrived in North America, the Haudenosaunee were already experienced diplomats. They had developed a sophisticated system of diplomacy that had kept their 5 nations and later their 13 nations together for hundreds of years. Each nation within the Confederacy had its own government, but they were united in their commitment to peace and their willingness to negotiate with other groups. The Haudenosaunee believed in the importance of consensus and were willing to spend a great deal of time discussing issues and making sure that everyone felt heard. When the first Europeans arrived in North America, the Haudenosaunee were quick to establish diplomatic relations with them. They recognized that the Europeans had a lot to offer, such as new technologies and trade goods. But they were also careful to protect their own interests. The Haudenosaunee were not afraid to stand up for themselves and their allies, and they were willing to go to great lengths to defend their sovereignty. One of the most famous examples of Haudenosaunee diplomacy is their interaction with the Dutch traders who arrived in the area that is now New York State in the early 1600s. The Haudenosaunee were able to use their diplomatic skills to negotiate favorable trade deals with the Dutch, and they were able to maintain their independence. The Dutch, in turn, respected the Haudenosaunee's diplomacy, and they established a policy of non-interference, which allowed the Haudenosaunee to continue to govern themselves and their territories. This relationship eventually led to the creation of the two-row wampum, a belt made of purple and white beads that symbolizes the friendship and cooperation between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. The two rows represent the two nations traveling side by side on the same river, each in their own canoe. This belt is still a powerful symbol of diplomacy and cooperation between nations today. However, the Haudenosaunee's diplomatic success was not always easy to achieve. During the Beaver Wars of the 1640s to 1700s, the Haudenosaunee found themselves at war with other Native American groups, such as the Huron and the Algonquin, who were backed by the French. The conflict was over control of the fur trade, and the Haudenosaunee were eventually victorious. However, they were able to maintain their diplomatic relations with the French and the Dutch. Despite the conflict, the Haudenosaunee were also able to negotiate with the British and the French during the American Revolution. They were able to forge alliances with both sides, and they were able to maintain their own independence. This was a remarkable achievement given the intensity of the conflict, and the fact that the Haudenosaunee were a relatively small group of nations. During this time, the Haudenosaunee were able to leverage their relationships with the different European powers to their advantage. For example, they were able to obtain firearms and other goods from the British and the French, which helped them to defend themselves against their enemies. They were also able to use the Europeans' desire for their alliance to pit them against each other and gain more favorable terms for themselves. Despite their diplomatic success, the Haudenosaunee were eventually forced to cede much of their land to the United States. However, they were able to preserve their culture and their identity, and today they continue to be a vibrant and influential group of nations. Now let's talk about the Haudenosaunee diplomatic practices. The Haudenosaunee had a number of diplomatic practices that made them skilled negotiators and mediators. One of their most important practices was the use of the Great Peacemaker's Lodge as a symbol of unity and peace. The Great Peacemaker was a legendary figure who is said to have created the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the lodge served as a reminder of the Confederacy's commitment to peace and unity. Another important diplomatic practice was the use of wampum. Wampum was made from the shells of clams and other mollusks, and was used as a form of currency and as a medium of exchange in diplomatic negotiations. The Haudenosaunee also used wampum belts to record the terms of treaties and other agreements. These belts were often highly detailed and were carefully crafted to ensure that the terms of the agreement were accurately recorded. Another important aspect of Haudenosaunee diplomacy was the use of oral traditions and storytelling. The Haudenosaunee had a rich oral tradition, and their stories and legends were an important part of their diplomacy. Stories were used to teach younger generations about their history and their culture, and to remind the people of their responsibilities to one another. The Haudenosaunee also had a unique approach to decision-making that contributed to their diplomatic success. Rather than relying on a single leader or a small group of elites to make decisions, the Haudenosaunee believed in the importance of consensus. This meant that decisions were made with the input of all members of the community, and that everyone had a say in how they were governed. This approach may seem slow and cumbersome by Western standards, but it ensured that everyone felt invested in the outcome and that decisions were made that benefited the community as a whole. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy's diplomatic practices and history have had a lasting impact on the world. Their ability to maintain peace and unity among their 5 nations and later 13 nations in the face of external threats is a remarkable achievement. Their use of diplomacy and negotiation to maintain their independence and sovereignty is an inspiration to us today. And their approach to decision-making and conflict resolution is still studied by diplomats and peacemakers around the world. So what can we learn from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy? First and foremost, we can learn the importance of diplomacy and negotiation. The Haudenosaunee understood the value of building relationships and finding common ground with other groups, even those who were potentially hostile. They were willing to take the time to build trust and understanding, which allowed them to avoid conflict and maintain their independence. We can also learn from the Haudenosaunee commitment to peace and unity. They understood that their strength lay in their ability to come together as a group and work towards common goals. They were able to set aside their differences and focus on what united them, which allowed them to resist outside forces that would have otherwise divided them. Finally, we can learn from the Haudenosaunee's approach to decision-making. They understood that decisions that affected the whole community should involve the whole community. They took the time to consult with all members of their society and build consensus, which led to better outcomes and greater buy-in from everyone involved. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is a powerful example of how diplomacy, negotiation, and a commitment to peace and unity can lead to success on the world stage. They were able to hold their own against some of the most powerful nations in the world, and they were able to maintain their independence and sovereignty. Their legacy continues to inspire us today, and their story is a reminder of the power of diplomacy and the importance of cultural diversity. Thank you for joining us today to learn about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and their history of diplomacy. If you enjoyed this episode and want to learn more about Indigenous history and cultures, please support us. Your support allows us to keep our videos free for everyone and helps us to continue sharing these important stories. We have lots of new episodes coming up, so stay tuned. Until next time, remember to keep learning and stay curious. Chapter 13. The Tree Still Stands. Symbols of Endurance and Peace. Long ago, when the Peacemaker first traveled across the land, from village to village and fire to fire, carrying his message of unity and peace, he came to a moment of deep importance, a moment not marked by a battle, or a treaty, or a great speech, but by something much quieter, the planting of a tree. It was a white pine, tall and strong, with 5 needles bundled together like 5 nations held by one idea. The Peacemaker called it the Tree of Peace, and under its spreading roots, he buried the weapons of war, literally the bows and arrows, the clubs and spears, all laid to rest so that they could no longer be used against one another. The message was simple, and it was powerful. From now on, our strength will not come from war, but from peace. And that tree, even though centuries have passed, is still standing. Necessarily the exact one, with the exact trunk and exact branches, but the symbol of it, the meaning of it, still grows in every longhouse, every council fire, every moment when disagreement is settled, not with fists but with voices, It's more than a tree now. It's an idea, a reminder, a living symbol of what was promised and what still can be. The white pine was chosen for a reason. It's tall. It lives a long time. Its roots stretch far beneath the surface, just like the roots of the Great Law. And those 5 needles, they are still used today to represent the original 5 nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. When people draw the Hiawatha belt, they often include that tree right in the center, because the Onondaga Nation, the heart of the Confederacy, is where the central fire was placed. And at that central fire, the tree of peace was said to grow. Now imagine it. The weapons gone, buried deep in the earth. The branches rising high above, offering shade to all who gather. The roots spreading in 4 directions, inviting anyone, yes, anyone who seeks peace to come and sit beneath them. That was part of the prophecy. If any man or nation outside the 5 nations shall obey the laws of the great peace and make known their willingness to do so, they may trace the roots to the tree and be welcomed into the Confederacy. That tree was not just for the Haudenosaunee, it was an invitation to the whole world, and in many ways, it still is. Today, the tree of peace is carved into walking sticks. It's woven into beadwork. It's stitched onto the backs of jackets and printed on community newsletters. It appears at the top of letters sent to state governments and at the bottom of resolutions passed by clan mothers. It's taught to children not as a myth, but as a reality of responsibility. Because peace, as the Peacemaker said, is not a feeling, it's a system, a way, something you practice, something you build, root by root, branch by branch. You can see that system in action when the council meets. There is no rushing, no yelling. The speaker holds a feather not as a gimmick, but as a symbol of the bird's clarity and vision. The speaker finishes. The next begins. Ideas float slowly around the circle, like smoke curling into the rafters. Sometimes there is disagreement. That's normal. That's welcome. But always they return to the roots of the treat, to the great law, to the original agreement, to the sense that we are all sitting beneath the same branches, and that those branches are big enough to hold all our voices, even when they don't match. The tree of peace has also come to symbolize something broader: survival. Think about it. Since the arrival of settlers, the Haudenosaunee have faced removal, war, broken treaties, residential schools, cultural erasure, and political suppression. And yet, they're still here. The longhouse is still open. The ceremonies still happen. The languages are being spoken again. The teachings are being taught to new generations. That tree, the one planted so long ago, still casts a shadow of protection and strength, even after everything. You can feel it in the way people speak about the old stories with reverence, yes, but also with a sense of purpose. Because it's not just about honoring the past, it's about continuing the cycle, about standing tall even when the storms come. About knowing your roots go deeper than anything that tries to cut you down. When visitors come to Haudenosaunee territory, they sometimes ask about the tree. They want to see it, touch it, photograph it. But the real tree isn't a single pine in a field. It's everywhere. It's in the attitude of the people, the way they speak to each other, the way they resolve conflict, the way they welcome newcomers who come in peace. It's in the land ceremonies. It's in the harvest dances. It's in the gentle way elders teach youth, saying, "Listen closely, because this is how we keep our roots strong." And for those who understand, the tree is not something you go to visit, it's something you learn how to carry. Sometimes, leaders from around the world are invited to witness a ceremony. Beneath the symbolic tree of peace, they're welcomed with formality. They're spoken to with kindness, but also with clarity. They reminded that peace isn't just the absence of war, it's the presence of justice, of inclusion, of unity built from difference. And they're invited to learn, to listen, to walk away with a different idea of what leadership looks like. Not dominance, not command, but service, rooted in the well-being of the whole, like branches working together to lift the sky. The teachings around the Tree of Peace are still being shared in classrooms, in homes, in digital media, and through artwork and activism. Some young Haudenosaunee artists paint it with glowing roots that wrap around the earth. Some activists use its imagery when fighting for water protection or land return. Some teachers use it to talk about climate, asking students to think like trees, low, steady, generous. Because when you're taught to think about the next 7 generations, you start to make very different choices. And that's what the Tree of Peace really asks of us, to think not just about today, but about tomorrow, and the day after that, and the quiet future that waits like a seed under the snow. So yes, the tree still stands, not untouched by history, but undefeated, not frozen in the past, but growing still. Its trunk may shift, its branches may bend, but its roots, the deep wisdom of peace through unity, have not been moved. And whether you are Mohawk or Muskogee, Oneida or Ojibwe, Cayuga or Cambodian, Seneca or Scottish, Onondaga, or just someone searching for a better way to live, those white roots still extend in all 4 directions, offering a place to sit, to rest, and to learn a new way of being together on this shared earth. And so, as night falls again and the fire dims, you can close your eyes and imagine the tree, the white pine, rising through time, its needles whispering the stories of those who came before, its roots holding firm, and its branches reaching out to anyone willing to carry peace forward, one careful step at a time. Chapter 14: Influence on the U.S. Constitution, Echoes. Across history, it's easy to think that the story of the United States began in 1776, with powdered wigs and dramatic speeches, with quill pens scratching out declarations under candlelight. But the truth is, the roots of American democracy go much deeper, and, if you follow those roots carefully, quietly, they lead you not just to Philadelphia, but to the cool forests of the Northeast, to longhouses and council fires, to a circle of nations who had already been practicing representative government for hundreds of years. Long before the Founding Fathers gathered, the Haudenosaunee had already woven peace into politics. They already had a constitution. They already knew what it meant to unite different groups under one law, one idea, one purpose, to live in balance, to speak in turn, to make decisions with care, and to respect the voices of all. Now, did the Founding Fathers really study the great law of peace? Did they sit and listen while Iroquois leaders explained the structure of the Confederacy? The answer, it seems, is yes, at least some of them did. And that's where the story gets interesting. In the 1700s, there were many meetings between colonial leaders and Haudenosaunee representatives. They weren't casual chats. These were big gatherings, councils held under trees, in forts, on neutral ground where speeches were made, wampum belts exchanged, and treaties discussed. And among the colonial observers was a man you've probably heard of, Benjamin Franklin. He wasn't just a printer and inventor. He was also a diplomat. He attended treaty councils, took notes, printed speeches, and respected the Iroquois way of governance. In fact, when the colonies began thinking about uniting way back in 1754, at the Albany Congress, Franklin brought up the Iroquois Confederacy as a model. He said, in his usual plain-spoken way, "If 6 nations of savages can unite and maintain a government for so long, why can't we?" Now, we can pause here and gently acknowledge that the word savages is outdated and unfair, reflected the views of his time, not ours. But behind that clumsy phrase was a real admiration for how the Haudenosaunee governed themselves, with clarity, consensus, and stability. And what exactly did Franklin admire? Well, let's look at the system. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy brought together multiple nations, each with their own identity, into one unified body. They had a central council, with appointed representatives called hoyana, from each nation. These council members didn't act alone, they were chosen by clan mothers, respected female elders who had the power to raise or remove leaders. The council met regularly, discussed issues, and made decisions unanimously, not by majority rule. Everyone had a voice. Everyone had to agree before action was taken. And there were checks and balances. No one person had too much power. Now compare that to the structure of the U.S. Constitution, written in 1787, a central government, a Congress with representatives from different states, a system of checks and balances, a division of powers. These ideas didn't come out of thin air. They came from study, observation, and yes, from indigenous governance. It's not to say the U.S. copied the Great Law directly, but rather that they were inspired by it, influenced in ways both large and small. There's also the matter of natural rights, the idea that people are born with certain freedoms, that governments should serve the people, not rule over them. That concept existed in European philosophy, sure, but it was also lived out in Haudenosaunee society, where leaders were not rulers, but servants of the people, expected to act for the good of all, not for their own power. And if they failed, the clan mothers could take their antlers, a symbol of leadership, away. No elections needed. Just accountability. This responsibility-based leadership model stood in contrast to monarchies, where kings ruled by bloodline and divine right. The Haudenosaunee showed that you could have order without kings, that consensus and peace could hold a government together better than fear and hierarchy. Over the years, other U.S. leaders also met with and learned from Haudenosaunee delegates. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and others studied forms of native governance as they worked on building a nation from scratch. They didn't always give credit where it was due. In fact, much of this influence went unacknowledged for generations. But the echoes are there in the structure, the values, the metaphors. Even the image of the eagle holding arrows, used in U.S. symbolism, reflects Haudenosaunee imagery. In the Great Law, an eagle is placed at the top of the tree of peace to watch for danger and protect the people. So when the United States began, it didn't begin from nothing. It grew from many seeds, some European, yes, but some native, too. And the Iroquois seeded the idea that different nations can work together under one law, with shared values, and mutual respect was one of the strongest. Of course, history is never simple. While the U.S. borrowed ideas from the Haudenosaunee, it also failed to uphold its own promises. Treaties were broken, land was taken, indigenous voices were pushed aside, even as their systems of governance were copied and celebrated. It's a difficult truth, a story of influence without acknowledgement, of ideas adopted but not honored. And yet, the Haudenosaunee have continued to practice the great law, even as the country around them changed. They didn't give up their system when the U.S. grew. They didn't dissolve their confederacy. They kept it alive, kept it functioning, kept the council fire burning. Today, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy still meets. The clan mothers still lead. The words of the Peacemaker are still spoken aloud, and young people are learning not just their history but their role in continuing it. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to recognize indigenous contributions to American democracy. Schools are beginning to teach the great law alongside the Constitution. Wampum belts are being studied not as artifacts, but as archives. Indigenous scholars and leaders are writing, speaking, sharing, lifting up the truth that was always there, just waiting to be heard. And maybe that's the most powerful echo of all, not just that the U.S. Constitution was shaped by the great law, but that the values of the great law, peace, unity, responsibility, are still needed today. In a world where disagreement often leads to division, the Haudenosaunee remind us that it is possible to disagree without falling apart, to govern with care, to make decisions slowly, together, with the seventh generation in mind. So the next time you hear someone say, "We the people," take a moment to think about who that really includes, and where those words might have been born. Think of the longhouse. Think of the tree of peace. Think of the council fire that still burns. And know that the foundation of democracy didn't just come from marble halls or powdered wigs. It also came from voices spoken in a circle under the sky around a fire, with the sound of pine needles rustling above. Because the great law of peace didn't just shape a nation. It still shapes the world, one quiet conversation at a time. Chapter 15. The Seventh Generation. Legacy and Hope. In the world of the Haudenosaunee, there is a promise that stretches beyond today. It moves past tomorrow. It even moves past your children's children. It travels quietly, patiently, into a time you may never see, a time known as the seventh generation. This teaching says that every decision made today, whether it's big or small, whether it's planting a field or writing a law, should be made with the next 7 generations in mind. Not just your own future, not just your own comfort, but the lives of those who are still waiting to be born. That's the measure of wisdom. That's the shape of true leadership. And it's not a metaphor, it's a way of life. To think 7 generations ahead is to stretch the heart. It's to live slower, listen longer, and speak more carefully. It's to ask yourself, if I make this choice now, will it nourish the people who come after me? Will it protect the land? Will it leave a trail they can walk without pain? In this way, legacy isn't something grand or boastful. It's gentle, it's humble, it's a gift left quietly, like good soil left behind in a garden. Today, across Haudenosaunee communities, the seventh generation principle is not just taught in schools or spoken of in ceremony, it's lived in seed banks where heirloom corn is saved for the future, in water protection projects led by youth, in language classes where children learn to say "I love you" in Mohawk, Oneida, or Seneca, in healing circles where trauma is named and released and replaced with hope. You can see it in the quiet pride of a clan mother watching her granddaughter learn to bead. You can hear it in a teenager speaking the Thanksgiving address from memory. You can feel it in a grandfather planting a tree, knowing he'll never sit in its shade, but someone will. There's something deeply powerful in that kind of thinking, the kind that puts the future first. It's the opposite of what the world often teaches now, where everything moves fast and people are told to grab what they can, while they can. The seventh generation mindset says, slow down, think wider, be kinder, you're part of something bigger. This vision has also found its way into global movements. Indigenous voices, including those of the Haudenosaunee, are being heard in international climate talks, human rights summits, and youth-led protests. Their messages are steady and clear. Take care of the earth, honor each other, think long-term, and lead with peace. And more, people are listening. Because in a time when so many systems feel broken, there's something deeply grounding about a system that has worked steadily for hundreds of years, not perfect, but enduring, thoughtful, flexible, and deeply connected to both the natural world and human dignity. There's a reason the great law of peace has lasted this long. It's not because it clings to power, it's because it gives power, and responsibility, and trust. And it teaches that every voice matters, not just the loudest, not just the oldest, not just the ones in charge. Everyone has a role, everyone contributes, even children, especially children, because they are the ones who will carry the burden when we are gone. And so, the seventh generation is not just a future goal, it is a present guide. It sits in the room during council meetings, like an invisible guest. It is the silent hand on the shoulder when decisions are made. It is the reminder that our time here is short, and our legacy is long. Some Haudenosaunee elders say that the Great Law isn't just about governance, it's about love. Not in a romantic sense, but in the way that people care for one another across time. To live by the Great Law is to live with respect, with empathy, with the understanding that what we do today ripples forward, touching people we may never meet. And that's a beautiful kind of love, isn't it? The love of ancestors we never knew, the love of descendants we'll never meet. A circle of care that stretches farther than the eye can see. And the circle keeps growing. Today, you'll find Haudenosaunee artists painting the stories of the Great Law in murals on city walls. You'll hear hip-hop artists referencing the Tree of Peace in their lyrics. You'll see language learners posting daily words online for others to share. You'll meet scholars writing books about clan mothers, and youth leaders organizing events where elders speak, and scientists designing projects that blend ancient farming practices with modern ecology. These are not just cultural expressions. They are acts of continuity, acts of resistance, acts of faith in the seventh generation. Even in digital spaces, the teachings continue. Wampum belts are being digitized. Oral histories are being archived. Interactive maps are being created to show traditional territories and clan roots. The technology is new, but the message is ancient. Remember who you are, and care for what's next. And for those who are not Haudenosaunee, but feel connected to these teachings, there is room. The Great Law teaches that peace is meant to spread, like sunlight through branches. You don't have to be born into it to carry it forward. You just have to listen, to walk gently, to speak truthfully, to protect the earth and the people around you. You don't have to wear a feather or recite the belts. You just have to honor the spirit of peace and act with the kind of care that ripples 7 generations ahead. So now, as this story winds toward its end, let's pause again and return to that image of a tree, tall and strong, its white roots stretching in all 4 directions. A tree that was planted not to mark ownership, but to declare peace, a tree that offers shade and shelter and guidance. And beneath that tree, in the quiet space where voices come together, a single thought rises like smoke. What will they remember about us 7 generations from now? Will they say we were kind? Will they say we listened? Will they say we protected the water, the seeds, the songs? Will they say we remembered the stories? Will they say we passed them on? Or better yet, will they not need to ask at all, because they'll already feel it in the land, in the language, in the lives they live? That's the hope. That's the goal. That's the quiet promise of the great law of peace. Not just survival, but continuation. Not just memory, but motion. A world where each person, each voice, is honored like a leaf on that old tree, dancing in the light of a future we can't see but that we can still shape, one small, good decision at a time. Conclusion. The fire never dies. Final reflections on the great law of peace. So now, with all the chapters told and the night drawing in, we return once more to the center of the longhouse, the council fire, the heart of the story. The flames are lower now, just embers glowing in the ashes, but they're still warm, still alive. That's the way it's always been. The Haudenosaunee say that the council fire of the great law has never gone out, not in times of war, not during removal, not through broken treaties or changing borders, not even during the silence of suppression, when languages were banned and ceremonies pushed underground. Somehow, through it all, the fire stayed lit. And that is what makes this story so extraordinary. Not just the diplomacy, not just the structure or the symbolism, but the continuity. The fact that a peace agreement forged so many centuries ago, by people walking forest trails and speaking in metaphor and spirit, is still alive, still guiding decisions, still offering comfort, still shaping futures. The great law of peace isn't a relic. It's a living agreement. A voice passed down, a rhythm kept alive through generations. And like the old tree planted at the center of the Confederacy, it bends with time, but does not break. The world has changed. The languages echo in new places. The people walk on different lands, wear modern clothes, use phones and screens. But the principles: unity, gratitude, equality, patience, and peace, they still rise each day, like smoke curling toward the sky. If you listen closely, you might hear them even now, in a classroom where a child begins the day with a word of thanks, in a council meeting where all voices are heard before decisions are made, in the planting of seeds, the tending of water, the telling of old stories in new ways, and in the hearts of people indigenous and non-indigenous who believe that we can still live by care, by listening, and by thinking 7 generations ahead. The fire never dies. It may flicker, it may dim, but it does not go out. And as the world spins forward, full of noise and speed, the great law still whispers, gently, steadily, come, sit, speak slowly, listen carefully, choose peace, because peace is not an ending, it's a path, and the path is still open.